If you have any questions that we don't get to, our email addresses will be at the end, and we would encourage you to get in touch with us. So first of all, Dr. Stockley is going to talk about how diagnostics and precision medicines are transforming cancer care pathways for patients. In the second section, we're going to talk about some of the policy and health system initiatives that are related to the new diagnostics and precision cancer treatments. So as I said, the speakers today, we don't have to go through that again. And I'd like to actually pass it over to Dr. Stockley to give us an overview of her role in the hospital and in research, and then to jump into some of the new treatment pathways that the cancer survivor community needs to know about. Over to you, Tracy.
Great. Thank you very much, Bill, for the nice introduction, and I'm very happy to be here presenting today. So yeah, I think just to start, I'll give you a little idea who I am. So I'm a clinical scientist at University Health Network, and I actually oversee the genome diagnostic labs, which we have in our Toronto General Hospital and at Princess Margaret Cancer Centre. And so as part of that role, I'm routinely signing out genetic tests on cancer specimens. And then another large part of my role here is to work with the oncologists and all of the scientists who are working up new drug developments and tests for precision medicine. So that's what I'll be talking about today. And just as a sort of introduction to my talk, I really just want to sort of highlight some key points. Oh, there it goes. Okay. So I just want to highlight a couple key points, which are here. Really just some introduction to what precision medicine is, how this are treatments tailored more to each patient's particular type of cancer based on genes or biomarkers. Precision medicine as a treatment option, and how that plays into other treatments that patients might receive. And then just where precision medicine may be going in future. And so just as, again, a general introduction to the idea of precision medicine, you likely know then that many different patients that have the same type of cancer may respond very differently to the same type of treatment, such as a chemotherapy. And after many years and decades of research, we now know that part of that reason is due to changes in the cells and genes within the cells that actually dictate why each person's cancer may respond differently. And so this is really the idea about precision medicine, that it's an approach to patient care where the treatment is actually selected based on a more specific molecular understanding of your disease. And when I say molecular here, it really means any combination of things that we measure in the lab. So I will probably talk a lot about genes because that's sort of my specialty. We're also, though, looking at different proteins which come from the genes, and sometimes this is even just generally called a biomarker. And I also just wanted to, although I will be talking about genes, just distinguish the cancers that I'll be talking about, which are acquired and not necessarily passed on in families, from those types of cancers that do run in families. So most cancers, 95%, do not run in families, and there's no risk to any family members if a mutation is identified in your cancer, and about 5% there is more a pattern within families. So I'll definitely be speaking about the former in this talk. And so precision medicine is also just an additional part of the care that you may be receiving. And this box on the side here is just showing different cancer therapy types and how they sort of go down in increasing precision, or the increasing ability to target specific parts of a cancer. So thinking, you know, generally at the top about chemotherapy, which is acting toward any dividing cell, something in the middle, such as drugs that stop new blood vessels from growing, all the way down to precision therapies, which are targeting very, very specific parts of the cell. And certainly precision medicine is really only a part of all of the care that you may receive. So it is an additional option and is often used in combinations with other treatments. So then this really is the promise of precision medicine, that without precision medicine, each patient would receive the same therapy. Some of those patients would benefit and others might not benefit, and some may in fact have quite serious side effects from that therapy. And the hope is then that by doing precision medicine, having more specific and tailored therapies, then we're going to have more patients that are likely to benefit with fewer side effects. And just to sort of zoom in on that idea a little bit more here, so how do we actually go about doing this? So targeted therapies really are treatment that are chosen by a test result. And so if you are thinking this is a part of a tumor, we actually would take some of the sample that would be obtained from that tumor, extract some important molecules from that, and then do a test that tells us whether that tumor has a very specific change which can be targeted by a drug. And that's in comparison to, again, some more general treatments like chemotherapy or radiation, where all patients receive these treatments irregardless of any test result. And so that really is then the idea about precision medicine. It's a combination of a targeted therapy, a specific drug or treatment that goes hand in hand with a companion diagnostic test for a specific biomarker. And as well as sort of going hand in hand for precision medicine, these two ideas also follow very similar developmental paths. So drug development does start from sort of a basic research and go through increasing refinement in discovery design into clinical trials that you may be aware of. And finally, once there's been shown to have benefit in those clinical trials, it goes to regulatory approval, a funding approval, and then launch. In a similar way, the companion diagnostic is following along at the same time. So we are working on these new tests, trying to identify which ones are the most useful for patients, putting them through a more rigorous validation, and then finally, again, going through a regulatory approval, funding, and a launch. And just I put in a few examples, some of these you may have heard of too, of some targeted therapies that I got this from a recent CADTH publication, so available in Canada. And so there is, again, a matching therapy and a biomarker test that goes along with that. And you can see here that some of these have the same biomarker name, and that's because different therapies might be directed more toward a particular stage of disease, or they may be used in combination with each other. And I also put in, this is some data that is from a US publication, but I wanted to put this in because I think it really shows this in a nice way, this idea of how important this is becoming. Part of the reason you're hearing more about precision medicine now and using genes to decide drugs is just that based on all the research that has been done, we have a lot better understanding of these things. And we also have new methods in the last 10 years that allow us to do more tumor testing. So there really is an explosion happening right now in this area, and that really is shown here on this slide where, you know, in the sort of decades between 1970 to about 2000, there was only a handful of drugs that were approved, and from about 2010, in the last 5 years, you can just see the number that have now been approved for patient care. And we sort of feel this really is just the tip of the iceberg, that we're now identifying and using a small number of these, but we know there are many more that are coming through that will be available for patients coming up. And so just again, a quick zoom into what a companion diagnostic test means. So patients will come in and have biopsies or small samples taken from their tumor. That part of the tumor then goes to a pathologist who confirms it is actually a cancer, and then it comes into other specialized testing where we can extract different proteins or genes from these tumors and performs different types of analyses on this to look at the results. And of those results, we are often then comparing them to many national and international databases to, again, get an understanding if this has been seen before, what are the known drugs and effects of that change. And then we will report back to the physician who will use that information to choose the best treatment or combination of treatments. And I also wanted to point out that this is not just something you would do right at the beginning of a cancer, but is something that could happen at different stages or be repeated during the progression of a cancer, because at some point you may change a therapy and there might need to be a need to then have another sample tested and to see the effects. And companion diagnostic tests are a very regulated thing within Canada. So any test that is returned to patients for their care has to be performed in a licensed and accredited, which for us means inspected, clinical lab in Canada. And each province has its own licensing and lab accreditation as per how healthcare is provincially regulated. And I just put this in as a reminder that although I have talked a lot about research, anything that is returned to a patient really has to meet a certain quality criteria so that patients can be sure they're receiving a safe and useful test. And just toward the end, to mention that although we have made a lot of progress in precision medicine, there's still much more that needs to be done. So some of the things that we're working on here are addressing issues such as not every patient can go in for another biopsy. For whatever reason, that tumor might not be accessible for biopsy. Are there different ways we can take samples? So for example, there is now the opportunity to actually use circulating blood samples to find tumor cells that we then can test rather than a biopsy. We're also constantly improving the sort of science part of it, the new methods, what it means, and contributing our information to databases that we can share to interpret the results. And then finally, we work a lot with our oncologist colleagues who are working on clinical trials, and so that they can try out new drugs and we can compare that to the biomarker information we're collecting. So overall then I think we're trying to overcome some of the limitations of precision medicine and getting more to patients through trying new sample types, improving the tests, and then increasing the number of therapies that are available through the clinical trials. And it just as an aside, if you are interested in clinical trials, certainly speak with your oncologist, and there are some websites that do highlight trials that are available. And finally then, I think to me it seems that really to maximize the potential for precision medicine, we need to address these sorts of things. So certainly funding for drug development, companion diagnostic test development, and that also really includes training all of the future healthcare groups that will have to provide this care to patients. Definitely helping to enable patients to participate in trials, clinical trials, to help bring these drugs into approved situations. Support for the regulatory and policy changes, and then appropriate approval by the bodies within Canada and funding for the clinical use. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tracy. I'd like to pass it over to Rachael to walk us through, and I think it's a pretty good handoff from understanding how the health system and patients are actually interacting and learning from these new tests that are coming through to actually find the right treatment pathways in the precision medicines, to some of the policy and health systems initiatives regarding these new technologies. So over to you, Rachael, and you and I will go back and forth, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So just a reminder to everybody to think about some of their questions or comments, and feel free to actually fill in that question box at the bottom right as we continue. So Rachael.
Thanks very much, Bill. That's great. So Tracy showed us a really excellent slide with the iceberg photo on it about looking at how many of these technologies have really started to sort of blossom in recent years. And policymakers are responding to this. So we've seen in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot more policies and strategies put forward by governments in Canada to really try and coordinate a lot of the work that's happening around precision medicine. Sometimes it's called personalized medicine, sometimes it's called precision medicine. On the screen in front of you is the cover of a report that came out in July 2015. It was led by Dr. David Naylor, the expert panel that put this report together. And one of the key recommendations within this report, as one of 5 main innovations that the federal government could support in order to have a broader impact across the country, one of those key innovations was really investing in a national strategy for the implementation of precision medicine. So Tracy spoke about a lot of the advances that we've seen on the research side and in developing tools and techniques to make this kind of information more useful and relevant for patient care. And so that's something that the health system really sort of struggles to adopt and to implement within it, is these new technologies, especially when you have technologies that represent a really different way of doing things. So, you know, previously, I think it's probably fair to characterize the general approach as, we have one tool and we use it for most people in a certain category. So that might be people who are living with a particular kind of cancer. We only have a few tools, and we'll use those for everybody. And then what we're seeing with precision medicine is much better information about who within those categories would benefit from certain technologies and therapeutics. So that's something that there is requiring a bit of an adaptation within the health system about how it looks at the use of new technologies, how quickly it can adapt these and implement them into the health system and make these useful, available, reliable for patients. So that was one of the issues that this panel tackled in its report. And one of that recommendation that came out about creating a national strategy to implement precision medicine. So it really focused on looking at all of the great work that is currently going on. And in particular in Canada, we have a really strong research community and scientific community in this area. And so one of the things that this panel emphasized was how these different models of care that are emerging are really data intensive. There's a lot of data. Next generation sequencing produces an enormous amount of data, and how we can use our information technology and that kind of infrastructure to be able to accommodate that and actually move forward within that and make that more useful from a clinical perspective. So of course, as Tracy also mentioned, there's been a rapid evolution and innovation within this space. So what the panel really wanted to see was the health system being able to not only adopt these, but also scale them up and incorporate new clinical insights that result from these kinds of technologies. So when the panel was looking at this issue, they had also, in a separate recommendation, they had put forward this idea that the federal government should create what's called a health innovation fund, or that's what the panel called it. And so when they were looking at the issue of precision medicine specifically, they said, it would be great to draw on this fund if the federal government wanted to create that fund. It would be great to draw on that fund and really start looking at precision or personalized cancer care as a starting point for using that fund to really develop a more cohesive approach across the country. So that's something that the federal government was advised to look into in July of 2015. Of course, since then we've had an election, and we've started to see sort of pieces of this report come out in some of the new governments. I guess they're not really new, they're probably halfway through their mandate, but in the Liberal government's priorities. So it's also this concept of there being funds available for health innovation in a national kind of a scale is something that had sort of come up a little bit during the Health Accord discussions. And we're still waiting generally for a bit of clarity in terms of whether that kind of fund has been made available for those provinces that have already signed agreements with the federal government, and whether that will emerge as sort of a distinct standalone thing that people can point to and say, when you're looking at health innovation and you're looking at precision medicine, it would be really great to move forward on some of these initiatives that were recommended by this panel. So the federal government is not the only government that has been looking at this issue. We've also seen precision medicine strategies in the cancer context come up in 3 provinces specifically very recently. So one being Saskatchewan, and in Saskatchewan's strategic plan for the Saskatchewan Cancer Agency, it's a 5-year plan. So it came out, it's meant to cover 2015 to 2020, and it was updated in June of last year. And one of the key objectives within this plan is for the province and to develop a molecular oncology strategy. So that's one kind of precision medicine that's that I think Tracy would be able to delve into greater detail about what that would look like specifically for patients, but that's something that this government has identified as a priority for them within their cancer system. Next, or in neighboring Manitoba, we have 2 strategies that sort of complement each other. They also have a multi-year cancer plan, and that came out in 2016. Within that, they really emphasized that they wanted to increase access to genetic testing in order to support personalized treatment for patients. And then, of course, within their diagnostic services, which is the second strategy that you see on the screen there, Diagnostic Services Manitoba is responsible for the laboratory system and the variety of other kinds of diagnostic services offered within the province. So within that whole part of provincial health service delivery in Manitoba, they identified a couple of things. For example, they wanted to plan, prioritize, and implement molecular diagnostic tests in their pathology program. So they gave an example of EGFR for lung cancer, which is one of the specific genetic variations that can come up with regards to that cancer specifically. They also noted that they wanted to introduce next generation sequencing into the clinical laboratory to make that kind of information more useful for clinical care of patients. And they also provided a couple of examples of how they wanted to do that and what they wanted to focus on there. So one example was EGFR for lung cancer, and another one were the two BRCA genes that are related to breast and other cancers. And I'm going to move ahead to the next province, the next slide, which focuses on Ontario. And in Ontario, again, with their most recent multi-year cancer system plan, they identified a couple of relevant items. So one being that they wanted to develop a personalized cancer care strategy that they would begin to implement in 2019. So that's still a couple of years ahead of us, but in terms of implementing wide-scale policy change within the health system, that's kind of just around the corner. So that's very exciting. And then to complement that, they also wanted to begin the implementation of a pathology accountability framework that's also tied to 2019. So for those in Ontario or interested in developments in Ontario, those are two things on the horizon that will help to give some shape to making these tools relevant and available for patients within the province. And this is, on the screen in front of us now, is what we have is sort of a general pathway that both drugs and devices will follow in order to become adopted into the health system and made available for patients. So each step along this arrow asks different questions and fulfills a sort of a different purpose in helping to provide health systems with information about how to best use these technologies and how to appropriately use the technologies. So starting at the outset, regulatory authorization, which is overseen by Health Canada, that's things like drug and device approvals. And so they're asking questions about safety, quality, and efficacy of these technologies. And so once these technologies are approved by Health Canada, they're made available on the Canadian market. So they're made available for patients and other customers to buy those products. After things have been made available to the Canadian market, they undergo what's called a health technology assessment, and this has been the case for many years for drugs and is a growing part of the path for medical devices. So things like the large machines that will do a lot of the next generation sequencing. And this is done, usually this is done at a national level through an organization called CADTH. CADTH stands for Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, and they've been working to expand their mandate to capture more information about medical devices and to provide guidance mostly to provincial governments and the federal government as well about those technologies and how those might fit in with the other options that are currently available. But as you can see, the regulatory decisions made by one body, the health technology assessment is conducted by other bodies, and then those recommendations from the health technology assessors, that gets incorporated into funding decisions. And these funding decisions are made by a bunch of different bodies, and mostly though, especially for things that are delivered in hospital, those decisions are made by provincial governments and the federal government for certain populations as well. And so there's all sorts of different steps that these products have to go through in order to be available to the health system and adopted in a way that is useful for clinicians and patients and made available to patients. So all of these steps are intended to give a bit of context to how these technologies will fit into the great scheme of things. Now I'll turn it over to Bill, who's going to focus more specifically on the question of who pays for diagnostic services.
Yeah. I think this is important, and we're going to come back to who evaluates them in a second, especially for the cancer community in terms of how patients, patient advocacy organizations, and the clinical community can actually engage in each of these processes. As Rachel mentioned, the majority of the budget for personalized testing in cancer actually comes out of the diagnostic services budget within the hospitals. Now that said, outside of hospital, some private health insurance programs, especially sponsored plans from employers, you may be able to access some funding through those plans. And increasingly, we're seeing Canadians who are looking for opportunities to purchase more information about their genes from consumer testing, either from programs that are run out of the United States. However, Canada is actually becoming a leader in consumer available genetic testing that will, in some cases, actually help people understand if they have a greater propensity potentially to contract cancer. We're still a ways away, and I think we will save a little bit of that for the Q's and A's and some discussion with Tracy. Just back to health technology assessment, they do essentially two things together. They look at for new therapies that are coming down the pipe. Are they clinically beneficial, and how do they compare in terms of the clinical benefits for patients and outcomes compared to other things that are available? And secondly, are they cost effective compared to what else is available? And it's not always comparing them against another drug. Sometimes it's comparing it against a surgical procedure or a watch and wait, or there's all kinds of different therapeutic options for different types of issues. As Rachel said, all the provinces and the federal government participate in the two major programs of CADTH, and that's the Common Drug Review and the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, and Quebec has its own agency, INES. When it comes to looking at therapies and diagnostics, you also have hospital, pharmacy, and therapeutics committees and provincial committees. One, for example, that would look at individual diagnostics would be the Ontario Health Technology Assessment Committee, OTAC. Also, private payers have HTA. What's interesting, Tracy showed earlier the development pathway for drugs and for diagnostics and how they run somewhat parallel. We're seeing some similar opportunities come up when you have a companion diagnostic to an individual therapy. And I think the question for this community is, how can you engage? Well, first, understand who are the experts on these committees. They're pharmacologists, pharmacoepidemiologists, clinicians, pharmacists, health economists, and sometimes they have public or lay voice or patients. And there are often, at least for drugs, specific timed opportunities for the patient community to actually weigh in and say, this is what this would mean to us if we had access to this therapy. We expect a similar opportunity for new diagnostic tests as they start to be reviewed in a more systematic manner. So speaking of reviewing the diagnostics, the companion diagnostics in a more systematic manner, I'll throw it back to Rachel now to talk about a consultation that CADTH is currently conducting regarding companion diagnostics and how it can run that to some degree in parallel with leveraging some of its other programs within CADTH, so that their expert committees have a very good idea of what the tests are that are available when they're actually looking at a treatment. So over to you again, Rachel.
Thanks, Bill. So CADTH has put together a proposed process for how it will evaluate companion diagnostics. So by way of recap, those are diagnostic tests that are tied sort of specifically to a drug, to a therapy. And so the way that they've approached it is they've essentially added on certain points and a parallel analysis to when CADTH is reviewing the drug product itself. So what people who are going through this process, usually manufacturers, what they do at the outset is they indicate that with this one specific drug that they're putting through the process, that there's also a companion diagnostic for it. And then as part of the process, this is the process that CADTH has proposed, and they have done some stakeholder feedback on that. That feedback period closed in January. So it remains to be seen if there are any changes to what they had proposed at the outset, but I'll walk you through what they had proposed. So the people who are submitting the package for CADTH to review have to provide clinical evidence about that companion diagnostic. So that looks at the analytical validity and then other questions around that test. So is this valid in a clinical context? Is this useful in a clinical context? And CADTH, what they do is they review that evidence and then they conduct a rapid response, which is a particular kind of analysis that CADTH will conduct on that test specifically, on that clinical evidence. So then they go ahead and they look at the economic evidence. So the person who has submitted, the manufacturer that submitted the package, they have to provide evidence about the cost effectiveness of that test, as well as some information about other tests, alternative tests, and they have to do what's called a budget impact analysis. So a budget impact analysis is different from a cost effectiveness analysis. A budget impact analysis is specific to different provinces and says what that province can sort of what they would be looking at in terms of the impact on their budgets. Again, for laboratory and diagnostic services or for drugs for their formularies, depending on the context. In this context, this is about the diagnostic, so that would be the impact on their laboratory and diagnostic services budgets. CADTH goes ahead and reviews that evidence, and also they also will provide an opportunity for patients and others to provide input. So when patients provide input, they're looking for information about patients' experiences with this technology. So in particular, those who have been part of a clinical trial, they want to know what that was like, and they're also interested in learning what patients' expectations are around those technologies. They'll also look to clinicians, in particular in this context, experts in pathology and laboratory testing, and then they look to their participating jurisdictions. So these are most frequently provincial governments, and they'll ask them about what are some of the issues that they may have regarding the implementation of the drug and diagnostic pair. So as I said, this is something that they've been consulting on, and they're planning to implement this in April, and we're looking forward to learning the results of that consultation and what the actual approach will be when they move forward later this year.
My understanding is it will be something of a pilot project where they're going to be testing it out and trying it out and there's no specific number of rounds that they're going to be looking at this as a pilot. But again, Rachel, we are looking forward to seeing how it actually works in practice. So just to close out the webinar portion and again open it up to a few questions, and thank you, Sharon, you've already put in one question, we'll get to that in a second. We wanted to just quickly highlight a few of the other areas or opportunities that the governments have or health systems have to actually deal with these things. The Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance is the collaboration of the federal government drug programs along with each of the provincial government plans that collaborate and work together and negotiate with manufacturers the listing terms for new products. Increasingly, we're expecting that some of those negotiations will include some kind of component where they would make them contingent on, say, the diagnostic test being available in each of the jurisdictions before a listing decision can be made. So those funding decisions, or at least the terms for those decisions, are going to be made at that level, and we expect that companion diagnostics will be part of those discussions increasingly.
And there are reports that historically that has happened for some of the companion diagnostics.
Yeah, excellent. So a second initiative that we're watching closely is the Canadian Association of Provincial Cancer Agencies has a cancer drug funding sustainability initiative that's underway right now. And that's to provide the PCPA, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance negotiators, and others in the cancer system with another level of scrutiny or review when it comes to implementation issues, especially around issues of affordability of the cancer therapies that are coming through. And this is just an aside from our perspective, and to speak to what Rachael and Tracy have touched on. If some of these products can be more targeted and be more effective, if price is not an issue, then you can expect that there will be better value for some of those investments. And so some of that discussion and understanding, I think, would be taken up and considered by CAPCA in that initiative. And there's an ongoing consultation that's taking place right now. If you're interested, look that up or let us know if you need access to links. There's other precision medicine initiatives that are happening at the federal and provincial level, especially around research. The Canadian Institutes for Health Research and personalized medicine working groups are active in this area. And finally, just as a point of note, the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, Bill S-230, I think it was? 201. 201, thank you. Bill S-201 just passed the House of Commons third reading yesterday, which is a big victory for a lot of people who have been involved in this area and working at it for many, many years. The U.S. has had the genetic non-discrimination legislation in place in the States, but the main point here is that, and this is a good way to turn it over to the Q&A to Tracy, is that the idea that an employer or an insurance company could discriminate against citizens if they get their genetic testing done and say, you know, we're not going to employ you, or we're going to deny you insurance, has been a barrier to people actually getting these tests done, and might be actually preventing them from taking some steps to actually deal with some health issues really early on. And with that, maybe I'd throw it back to Tracy for some final words, maybe on that, and then we'll open up to Q's and A's. Tracy?
Sure, yes, yeah. I'm also very happy to hear that S-201 has moved forward. I do think that the concerns about discrimination based on your genetic information relates a bit more maybe to the inherited side of tests. So typically for any of these cancers, any changes we find don't impact on anyone else in your family. But certainly for things that run in families, that has been a big concern. And there have been patients who really haven't wanted to go forward with genetic testing that could be helpful for their care for those spheres. So I think that S-201 now being in play is very helpful for patients.
Excellent. Thanks, Tracy. We've got a couple of questions here that came up, and I think we should probably jump right into them. The first was from Sharon. Do you envision a time when all cancer patients will receive genomic testing? How far off do you think that's going to be, and what can be done to bring the cost of genomic testing down? Mm-hmm.
Sure. And so by genomic, I think you mean there like a fairly extensive amount of testing. Would that be correct? I guess there is a difference for me between the testing we do now, where we just do a few genes and the cost is not very large, to genomic testing, where you're really looking at all of the 20,000 genes that are in your cells. I do think, and there is a lot of talk about this, about, and not just cancer patients, but all patients getting sort of a genomic profile done at some point in their life, because it also maybe has the potential to lead to preventative measures. If you're at particularly high risk, maybe knowing that in a really concrete way from your genes might change behavior. I do think those kind of widespread tests are definitely coming. Even now we see, for example, if you're diagnosed with lung cancer, we will always go and do the EGFR assay. So I think those things are definitely starting to begin. Patients of all of a certain group getting a genetic test, and I think it's just a matter of time, as you sort of mentioned, until the cost comes down, that becomes more widespread. As far as when the costs come down, this is happening all the time, really. Every day in the lab we're getting information on new methods that are helping to drive down that cost. So I think it's hard to know exactly when, but definitely that will come. But I think the other part to keep in mind is not just cost, but also, as Rachael mentioned, clinical utility. How useful is that information for patients to actually decide on their care? And there is still, even if we drive down the cost, there's still a big knowledge gap that we have to fill in about that part.
Thanks very much. Tracy, I don't know if you have any thoughts or experience with what CAPCA is doing. This is the Canadian Association for Provincial Cancer Agencies, related to their sustainability initiative. It's something that we mentioned towards the end, and if you don't, I'll throw in my 2 cents on it. But I thought you might want to react to what Catherine Hayes has posed to us, considering the options that molecular medicine might give us. Should we be concerned about CAPCA's delisting drugs? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, only the most general. I'm sure you would give a much more in-depth answer. I mean, it does concern me quite a bit. I do think that we are in a time where if we can have strategic funding to develop the right initiatives around this, we really can, you know, sort of move this field forward a lot. So, and yet I know we exist in a time of budgetary constraints. So, yeah, I don't know. You know, for me, I think improving funding for science and lab medicine and all of the oncology trials really is what we need. But yeah, I understand the challenges. So I'm sure you have a much more insightful view of that.
Well, one of the challenges right now is that there isn't too much information on what they're potentially going to do. I think that they're in the early stages of looking at affordability. On one hand, and some of the listeners might have heard me say this in the past, but we can remember that in 2011, Canadians spent more on one single drug than they did on all oncologics combined. We spent over $1 billion on one specific drug, and that was Lipitor. And yes, the oncology budgets are increasing at a faster rate than others. I think the question that governments and cancer agencies have to ask is, what's the value that they're getting out of that, and more broadly, what are patients getting out of that? Are we creating a system where cancer is no longer a death sentence for many and that it becomes a chronic disease? And if so, what is the value of that? Are we willing to actually increase those budgets to accommodate for some of the innovations that are coming down the pipe? And what are the potential downsides of taking out of the toolbox for clinicians some of the older products that might well work for certain people? So I think that, you know, that the challenge is definitely there. The question is, how is the toolbox regulated, and how is that affordability lens brought onto that in a more active and proactive way, so that you're not cutting off the potential for innovations, but at the same time you are addressing some of the budget concerns that governments and private payers have. So that's a long way of saying that we don't have the answers, but to put things a little bit in perspective in terms of how much we actually spend on cancer and oncology, from what I'm seeing, and we do a lot of work in terms of the forecasts and the market, etc. The sky is not falling. Despite increases in cancer budgets, it's not as bad as some people make it out to be.
And if I could just mention too, when I also think, like, when we talk about affordability, that it's important to think as well, if you use a new treatment, even though it may seem expensive in that cost, what are the things that patients are avoiding because they have that? So do they have fewer side effects, so they have to spend fewer visits to hospital? So it's more of a systemic question too, I think. And I do think that is really hard for funders and agencies to get good data about. And so I think that always plays into this a bit for me too. We know that these new tests may cost more than an old test, and yet what are the associated benefits that you get from having that available?
That's great. And I think you might have cut out a little bit there, Tracy, but I think your main point was, how can the evaluators and the funders really consider the wider societal benefits in terms of keeping people at work and fewer hospital visits, etc.
Right.
In the long term.
Yes.
So,
yes.
A couple of questions from Roman, and thank you. What happens in the case where a drug is proven to be more efficacious when a biomarker or a specific gene is present, but can still provide benefit if the individual lacks that specific gene? And a couple of the, well, one of the suggestions there is around immunotherapy and PD-L1 expression.
Yes, sure. Yes, yeah, that's very true. And precision medicine drugs don't need to work only on a very particular target. So you're right, it may be something more general, like altering immune function, as in PDL. Yes, so, and even then, sometimes we are even doing biomarker testing because only patients who are negative for a biomarker will respond to the drug. So yes, it is, and I think I did try to show this in one of them, that there is a sort of a ladder of increasing precision for these drugs, and sometimes we don't need to be working at the most precise level to still have a benefit for more patients.
So we'll turn to one question from Sharon, and then maybe we'll go back to Roman. Do you think there might be an opportunity for all cancer patients who don't respond to traditional treatments to then have genomic testing? And is that something that might be more feasible and present more clinical utility? And again, I think, Sharon, just to recap one of Tracy's questions, we're talking about whole genome sequencing. If the cancer patient is not responding to traditional treatments, should we look at all of their genes and figure it out from their pathways?
Yeah, and I did mention before too about, I think, our knowledge gap. So at this point, we could certainly sequence technically everyone's genes, all the genes, the whole genome sequencing, but the information we get from that is not as extensive as you might think. So in our clinical tests, this is the issue of clinical utility. We may only test 20 or 40 genes, but the information on those 20 or 40 genes provide 90% of the knowledge we know about how to act on them. So yes, it is still, I think, a learning curve for us, that we technically can do a lot of things without having as much information benefit from that as we would hope.
So this is a question I'd actually throw up to both to Rachael and Tracy. Again, from Roman. Thank you, Roman, for your question. What are some of the variances we're seeing in terms of genetic testing currently? Do they vary by province, by hospital? If I get diagnosed in Sudbury and are being seen by an oncologist in Northern Ontario, would I have access to the same levels and types of testing as somebody who is downtown and actually is consulting with you, Tracy? And then over to Rachael in terms of how things are working across the country, in case you both want to weigh in there.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So anything that is an approved drug for patient use and has a companion diagnostic, there would be standards about how each lab or each site is providing that. So if it is an approved drug with a companion diagnostic, there would be say a required amount of mutations that each lab would have to detect if they were running that. I think perhaps the only regional difference may be a bit easier to join clinical trials in which the oncologists, more of the research realm, where the oncologists are trying out many larger sets of genes, and those tend to be in the major centers.
Thanks, Tracy. And looking across the across the country at the different provinces, I think, Roman, in short, the answer to your question is yes, they do vary by province. I'm thinking in particular of Oncotype DX. So that's actually a bit different from what Tracy was talking about, in that particular test is analyzed by its producer, and I believe that they may be in Texas. They're in the States, and so that test in particular, coverage has been made available by the BC Cancer Agency, for example, and there's a specific process that they have within that agency so that patients can access that specific test. And then in Nova Scotia recently, that was the subject of some very strong advocacy by a patient group called Rethink Breast Cancer. And so, as you can see, there isn't a lot of uniformity, and that's something that patients do struggle to access based on where they are located.
Yeah, and I think Tracy, earlier you showed a bit of a screenshot from the CADTH environmental scan on companion diagnostics. I think that's an opportunity for organizations like CADTH and other national quality councils or provincial quality councils to keep an eye on what's available, actually globally. Let's not think that just the variations within Canada can be an issue. Let's see what's available in Europe and the States, and I know that the cancer community, especially cancer patient advocacy groups, are constantly looking for the cutting edge, and the more that they look, the more that they're going to find that there are tests that are available as much as there are new therapies.
That's a really great point, Bill. And to your question, Roman, I think that there's also a great degree of variety or variation across the country in terms of clarity on what the process is for having those new tools and new tests made available within each province. So I'm thinking in particular Ontario has a very clear pathway to add new biomarker tests. So not specifically in cancer, but sort of more generally. Whereas that pathway and that approach, that sort of approach that governments will take, is less clear in other provinces. And for companion diagnostics, that process is more clear in Quebec, for example, than in many of the other provinces. So that's also an interesting point for patients to keep in mind when they're looking at being active on this issue.
Yeah. I think we probably have time for one final question, and thank you, Marilyn, for yours. I think it's actually an opportunity to cover something that we might not have really gone into much detail on. Is it true that there are more tests available than the availability of specific targeted therapy drugs based on those results? And there is a difference, and Tracy, you jump in here for sure, between what they're calling homebrew tests, as in within a hospital, they will come up with a diagnostic that will be able to measure, for instance, the expression of a certain biomarker, versus something that would be either commercially available, looking at gene expression, even to a point where you've got multiple assay tests where you're looking at for a whole bunch of different biomarkers given one biopsy. So there are just a huge range of tests that are coming available either commercially and external to hospital and diagnostic labs or within the labs. So I think the answer is yes to that, but there's some good reasons for that. Maybe Tracy, you can elaborate.
Yes, sorry, I'm just trying to summarize here. So I guess it's the question about the difference between smaller tests that only look at a few genes versus much larger panels available?
Well, that was the way I kind of morphed it. Is it true that there are more tests available than the availability of specific targeted therapy drugs based on those results?
I think, again, it sort of, for me, breaks down into those drugs that are actually approved for patient use, in which case there really would just be specific tests matched to that drug. It may not always be the same test, so you might get sort of a protein assay and a genetic assay for that one drug that helps inform the decision, versus maybe things, again, that are happening more in clinical trial or research. Because definitely, and just as an example, we have a 500 gene panel that we are running in our clinical trials, and not all of those genes have a matched drug target. But we're doing that more as an investigational research. But I think anything that is available in the clinical stream really for patient use, there are only tests that are linked to that drug use, because in the end that's how they are actually approved for funding. And can I just say, I also maybe just want to mention about homebrew. So although that does sound sort of ad hoc and something you might be doing in your kitchen, we do actually have quite a lot of stringent validation and oversight of those tests. We call them lab-developed tests. And it's important that we make those, because sometimes a new gene may come in and commercial labs or commercial suppliers have not yet put that gene into their panels, because it takes them some time to do that as well. And then we go through a very rigorous validation and confirmation of those assays before we put them into use.
Excellent. Thank you for correcting my nomenclature. We're going to be, I'll be very careful going forward. Not to call it homebrew. They're laboratory-developed tests. So thank you, Tracy. We're gonna close the webinar. Do you have any or Rachel, any final thoughts for the cancer survivor community that you want to keep in mind as this issue evolves?
I would just like to mention, I do think that if there are people listening who really would like to share their patient story, I do think that's very important. I know certainly from the lab side and our, we tend to talk a lot about the science and all of the parts around that, but hearing patient stories is very powerful, and especially as Bill and Rachel have mentioned, for advocacy with some of these groups.
Thanks. Rachel, anything to conclude?
Simply to highlight the fact that this is a really dynamic and fast-moving area. Lots of changes on the horizon, so keep your radars up, and we look forward to being able to discuss some of those changes in the future.
Yeah, And this is really early in the year for the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network's advocacy series. So I'd encourage people to provide feedback to this webinar. We mentioned a few other issues that are related. So anything that we're talking about here that you think deserves its own special webinar or further investigation or further discussion with the community, please get in touch with, and I'll flip to the final slide, which has got Jackie's information. Let us know, because the group here really depends on your ongoing feedback. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Tracy and Rachel for spending the hour with us and all the time to prepare for this the presentation, and everyone who logged in. Really appreciate the opportunity to interact with you, and keep the questions coming. Thanks a lot, Tracy. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks, Rachel. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.